People live these stories as pieces of life. These words were spoken by Togolese psychotherapist and anthropologist Luca Diekwe in a conversation about belief in supernatural phenomena and the impact on mental health amongst African people. They come to my mind each time the topic of mental illness among African people comes up, and they were certainly on my mind as I read the two books we are focusing on this month. Those are Shintu, a Baganda epic by Ugandan author Jennifer Makumbi, and Almajus, or The Animist, a Tuareg epic by Libyan author Ibrahim Al-Koni. And so these words are the framework through which we will examine the folklore of mental illness in African literature in today's episode. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Hello again, friends. So I know that last week I said we would talk more about folkloric places in African literature, but I realized that we've dedicated 2 episodes to that topic already. So today we're switching gears to another fascinating topic which comes up in the books we're spending time with this month, and that is the folklore around mental illness. Now, in the West and thus in the global mainstream, mental illness is often defined and contextualized following the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and other such systems. And these are systems of classification and reference published by organizations like the American Psychiatric Association. And they aim to describe mental disorders and offer healthcare providers information on how to diagnose and treat or manage these disorders, right? And what this means is that to most of us modern people for whom Western systems of knowledge are the norm, our understanding of mental illness or neurodivergence, if you want to use a broader term, is shaped by this science adjacent system, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But in indigenous societies across the world, the different constellations of behaviors that we call neurodivergence or, the broader term, but that's the broader term, or mental illness, which can be a bit more restrictive. Like most matters of life or death, for better or worse, are described usually within the context of a story, right, in which a character manifests the behaviors and their relationships with the different forces that shape the lives of the people telling the story. And this could be spiritual or mundane forces, is used to explain the behavior. And it's not a scientific system in the strict sense of the word, but these ways of classification are subject to their own internal logics, which, even when imperfect, like the DSM can be, by the way, offer really deep insight about who the people believe they are and the place they can offer people who are neurodivergent. This can be a tremendous hindrance, right? We've probably all heard horrifying stories about the way people who have psychotic disorders are treated, but it also offers unique opportunities. Since people live these stories as pieces of life, the story told about a given behavior can engender a certain attitude towards the affected person in a way that knowledge of, say, the genetic origin of certain mental illnesses or, ways of perceiving the world might not. And even more, I think it opens up space for the community to learn things from these people, which are, bolstered and made possible by their unique ways of perceiving the world, which, the community otherwise might not if they cast them as illnesses. Thus, a curse really can become a blessing. In Shinto, for example, a psychotic disorder of some kind described as a curse is the sometimes melodious and other times bloodily discordant note in the epic symphony that is the story of the novel's Eponino's clan. The author, Jennifer Makumbi, is absolutely thorough in her exposition of the different Baganda cultural and folkloric beliefs as she walks us through the premonitions and visions and spirit possessions that mark the lives of her characters. And she adeptly communicates the intellectual or spiritual wrestlings of the novel's Western, educated or oriented characters, and the matter of fact, but no less complicated faith of the more traditional characters as they, deal with and confront the family's woes. In one scene, when a family member is possessed by an ancestral spirit, Misi, one of the clan leaders who is known for his particularly brilliant mind, but who will himself eventually succumb to psychosis, watches avidly, excited by the opportunity to observe the transpossession phenomenon. It's actually funny. And meanwhile, the woman who is herself possessed, she was at first just blatantly skeptical of all the traditional beliefs her family was espousing, and then she's left to grapple with her own experience of possession. And what is great about Shinto is that the author does not give us any clear answers, right? She just simply points at the reality as if to say, hey, like it or not, this is who people are and this is what they believe. And we simply cannot just throw it away because they differ from Western ways of perception. Ibrahim Al-Koni is, more subtle in Almajos, and I thought this was just a fascinating contrast. So there are no fraught reflections on what mental illness means or why certain characters behave the way they do. No, the book is, it's a gigantic tome, but I cannot recommend it highly enough because it's so brilliant. And Udat, one of the male protagonists, whose singing voice made even the desert itself hold its breath in awe, is also just a man whose love for the desert's mountain far surpasses any obligation he feels towards his fellow humans. Not even a wife and child are able to keep him from his first and only love, and he eventually abandons them to go, wander the mountains. Is this unusual? Absolutely. But it's also what happens when a man hears the bird of paradise sing and is able to echo its otherworldly tunes, as described in the novel, even when his own pride leads him to perform an act which defies one of the mountain's most sacrosanct rules, defiance for which he pays with his life. When Musa, another character, cries because he believes that when people cut acacia trees for firewood, they are cutting his children. The women of the village cry with him because he's a dervish, and dervishes are treated with affection and care, and their miscues and oversights and failings are readily forgiven. And being a dervish does not always protect Musa from the anger or abuse of the people in his community. But it really, when I thought about it, functions as a safety blanket on which he can always fall from whatever heights his outlandish actions take him. And it, acts as an insurance of sorts in a society in which, ostracization could mean certain death at the hands of the unforgiven desert or her eternally vengeful companion, the bright burning sun. And if you want to hear more about the desert and the sun, you should listen to last week's episode. So African folklore just teems with many such characters whose unique perceptual capacities mark them as spirit or gods touched. And sometimes their antisocial behavior perplexes and throws their communities into turmoil, but this, is accepted as part of the package. And a couple of years ago, I gave a talk about one of such characters, the enfant terrible, who is peculiar to African folklore. So I won't go into the particular details of this character, and I'll put a link to the talk in the episode notes. But they are just an excellent example of how, you know, seeing the world in these different ways, how, giving people space to perceive differently and understand the world differently. Traditional folklore gives us, the tools to revisit often fraught narratives around people on the spectrum of neurodivergence or people with mental illness and, recast them in a more human light. So, this is just a brief exposition about the topic from these two books with some of the more interesting characters. I really hope you can buy the books and read them. And I hope you continue to explore this topic because I think it's just endlessly fascinating and helpful how fiction can help us look closely at ourselves, at the world that we live in, and come to understand things a bit better. Another book I'm thinking about in this light is The Icarus Girl by Helen Oyeyemi, which gives another interesting view of how folklore and culture influences mental illness, and how the ways that people have come up with to reconcile and holistically deal with these different ways of being can be helpful in ways that Western science and Western psychiatric or psychology are not. And why shouldn't they? We look at the practice of psychiatry and psychology and therapy as practiced in the West. It is deeply, deeply, deeply embedded with references to mythology and folklore from the Greeks, from the Romans. Perhaps, just perhaps, someone who cannot relate to the Oedipus complex, for example, might, relate better to the myth of Yemaya and her son, and how that tragedy birthed something more positive in the community. So we're going to stop here for today. This is one of those topics that I will tend to tread very carefully around, because mental health in and of itself can be a really fraught topic, and you don't want to be insensitive to people's struggles or act like you know better than the professionals. But like I said, fiction is one of the ways in which we can, in a really low stakes environment, examine some of our beliefs and learn new things. So I have some recommended reading in the episode notes, which I hope you will check out. This episode is more me talking than sound effects, which I have had so much fun playing with these last couple of months. And I will see you guys next week as we round up our discussion of folklore in African literature, and we'll find out what next we'll talk about. Meanwhile, keep an eye out this week, because the next iteration of the Mythological Africans quarterly essay, which this year we're looking at neck rings in African culture, is going to be dropping at some point. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you all again for listening, and see you next time.